I've read every issue of X-Men ever. What have you done with your life? All that reading leads me to believe that there's only one Marvel adaptation that has done the comic justice. But you'll have to hear me out. Hi, I'm Greg. This is Castro on Culture, where I discuss movies, TV, comic books, and whatever else I feel like. By the end of the video, I hope I'll have impressed you enough with my quips and jabs and general rhetorical ability to where you might consider subscribing. And also, spoilers are ahead for literally every X-Men adaptation ever, but they're all over a year old, so if you haven't seen them, are you even a fan? Classic X-Men comics like the Dark Phoenix saga are famously hard to adapt. 2006's X-Men The Last Stand tried to adapt it, and it didn't go well. And Fox tried again with 2019's The Dark Phoenix, and that went even less well. As an X-Men fan, I actually don't hate either of those movies. I think once you get over the disappointment of how dumb they are campy fun. There are a lot of things wrong with them, but the prime reason they both fail at adapting the comic is that they haven't had the time that the comic had to set up the story. The Dark Phoenix saga isn't just the issue where Jean Grey dies. It's the dozens of issues where we see her and the X-Men get close while she loses control of her powers so that her ultimate death actually means something. Movies don't have nearly as much time to build like this. I think a good Dark Phoenix saga adaptation would probably need somewhere around 3 to 6 movies to really get us caring about a new version of Jean and her relationship to all of her friends. If serialization is the key to telling a good X-Men story, then TV should be better suited to the task. But historically, I think even those adaptations haven't worked super well. 1992's X-Men the Animated Series has some memorable bright spots, but it's held back by what it is. It's an inexpensive Saturday morning cartoon. The animation is stiff, the writing is PG, and while it respects continuity, it also tries to speed run through a lot of big stories to fit them into bite-sized episodes. Just to keep using the Dark Phoenix saga as an example, the animated series tells the story across 9 episodes, which seems meaty, but that really only amounts to 3 hours of runtime, which is only a little longer than the movies. They have to rush the whole idea of the Phoenix Force, and the episodes tend to be very plot heavy, losing focus from Jean, and following all of the outer space action that the producers assume little boys watching the cartoon wanted to see. But it's not as if X-Men the Animated Series is the only X-Men cartoon to exist. There was also X-Men Evolution in 2000. And my most controversial take in this video is that I actually think in some ways it's better than the animated series, at least in that it's closer to the comic in the way I'm wanting. That's controversial because on its face, X-Men Evolution is a total remix of the comic. The X-Men and their enemies all just happen to be teenagers going to the same high school in New York, with Mystique being their principal, and characters like Storm and Wolverine and Beast basically all serving as their teachers. So the producers essentially turned the franchise into a teen drama. But a teen drama has a lot in common with a soap opera, which is what the comic is, so you can imagine why I like it. To continue using Jean Grey as a point of comparison, this show has a much better version of Jean Grey that spends a lot of time hanging out with her female friends. She mentors Kitty, who was not actually even in the animated series, which also hurt it because she's one of the best characters in the comic. And Jean also has a great romance in X-Men Evolution with Scott. The show never actually got the chance to do the Dark Phoenix storyline, which is so ironic because this is the one show that could have actually delivered on the emotional beats of the comic storyline. Ultimately, though, it is a 2000s teen drama with a lot of cringe. The X-Men of the comic are a family, but they're also a badass paramilitary squad. And so this show just leaves you wanting the good relationships, but also the more epic plots. When I watch it, I find myself wishing it could move beyond high school. So then that leads us to 2009's Wolverine and the X-Men, which on paper had every chance to be the kind of series I'm asking for. It came out in an era where a lot of grounded, mature, soapy action adventure cartoons were being developed. Something Wolverine and the X-Men really had going for it was that it was picking up later in the X-Men's continuity, and it had more or less the full cast from the comic, which no other adaptation had ever really done before. Where this show struggles is that it's almost too faithful to the comics, in the sense that it just wants to incorporate just about every era into its 26 episode first season. The team lineup and the use of Genosha is taken from the modern Grant Morrison and Josh Whedon comic runs, but then a lot of episodes pull things from the 70s, like Wolverine's fight with the Hulk, or the Days of Future Past timeline. It's got 80s characters like Mojo and 90s characters like Maverick. In fact, almost every single episode introduces a new character. Where I'm going with this is that the show does too much in a slightly different way than the animated series. It's not that it's trying to be super action packed, but more that it's just so in love with the comics that it's kind of just arranging a collage of them without provoking a lot of meaning. Everyone ends up being pretty one dimensional Cliff Notes versions of their comics counterpart. Some end up even worse than that. Cyclops, pretty infamously, is portrayed as this completely depressed burnout, which is inspired by how he was in the 2000s comics after Jean died the second time. But he bounced back more quickly in the comics. The show also neglects Storm. Cyclops and Storm are the two best X-Men in the comics. So if an adaptation doesn't get them right away, it's already not going to do much for me. And not for nothing, pretty much none of the adaptations discussed so far do get them both right. And so that brings us to the MVP, the reason for this video, the one good X-Men adaptation. X-Men 97 was a big question mark with fans when it was announced. Those with a lot of 90s nostalgia who love the animated series were excited to hear it was getting a sequel. But for me, who never quite loved it, the revival sounded like a little bit of a bad idea. The animated series was so of its time, and its fans are mostly now grown men. Just making more of that show with all of its corniness and rushed plotting aimed at children would be really unsatisfying for its grown fans. X-Men the Animated Series also covered most of the major storylines from the 70s and 90s comics, so it didn't seem like it had a lot of ground left to cover. But luckily for fans, the writers at Marvel Studios had a vision. Moon Knight writer Bo DeMaio knew the series needed to be a continuation and not ignore the continuity of the original, but he also seems to have understood that the show needed to grow up. The huge win of making this show in 2023 is that it's on streaming with fewer content restrictions, a bigger animation budget, and a built-in adult audience. There was no longer a financial incentive to keep it dumbed down to a certain degree and make it appeal to young boys. So, X-Men 97 is somewhat more adult, with a little more emphasis on the X-Men's relationships and a little less emphasis on space battles. But Bo DeMaio's genius really shows when you consider the comic storylines he chose to adapt. X-Men 97 Season 1 is primarily a mix of the Inferno, Operation Zero Tolerance, and Fatal Attraction storylines from the comics. And if you read the comics, you know that those are fairly controversial storylines. I think he chose these storylines first and foremost because they hadn't been done on the original show. But second, because he knew they had interesting kernels in them. And so he brings those good kernels out while smartly writing around the weaknesses of these storylines. That's his secret sauce, not just adapting the comic, but improving upon its weaker aspects. My main thesis is that the X-Men comic is good because of its character arcs born of its long soap opera continuity. And Inferno does represent a big, long gestating character moment for Cyclops. It's the moment he permanently rejects the mother of his child, Madeline Pryor, and recommits to Jean Grey, who had come back to life. But it does this in such an 80s way. Madeline does a complete 180 as a character and becomes the Goblin Queen, a sexily dressed supernatural villain who turns all of New York into a supernatural nightmare. This is so transparently an homage to Ghostbusters that at one point Ghostbusters is even directly referenced. Comic crossovers are for the most part shameless marketing gimmicks designed to sell extra issues, and Inferno is no different, covering a lot of the same beats over and over again between the different X-Men comics at the time, like New Mutants and X-Terminators. If you don't know who the X-Terminators are, you're lucky. They're the worst X-Men team ever, and you should never, ever read about them. Although, side note, they do weirdly seem to be making an appearance in the Wolverine game coming out later this year. But the biggest issue with Inferno is that the treatment of Madeline is completely sexist. She's a clone of Jean Grey, created by the villain Mr. Sinister, which, yes, these names are dumb, but that's backstory for another video. It's really not Madeline's fault that she turns into the Goblin Queen. She's just a pawn. Her whole life is existentially horrifying, but the comic treats her with no humanity, instead having her go nuts and try to kill her son before Jean stops her and she blows up. Bo DeMaio completely forgoes the crazy Ghostbusters takeover of New York, having Madeline just attack the X-Men directly. Since he just has his main animated series cast to work with, he doesn't have all the crossover baggage that the comic had. There are no new mutants or ex-Terminators. And rather than have Madeline go completely mad, he shows that her whole Goblin Queen transformation was all Mr. Sinister's doing. And Jean Grey frees her from his mind control rather than kill her. She and Scott then have a nice moment together, giving their son Nathan over to the X-Man Bishop, who will protect him in the future. That didn't even happen until years later in the comics. So, with a few key changes, Bo focuses the story of Inferno on the love triangle between Cyclops, Jean, and Madeline. And he has the story climax with the departure of Cyclops' son and Madeline leaving to live her own life. And when she does die later, it's in a really meaningful moment with Cable, or her grown up son. It takes up just one episode instead of dozens of comic book issues. It's dramatic and it's character focused. This is the rare adaptation that actually improves upon the comic. However, Operation Zero Tolerance is the comic that Bo DeMaio uses to make up the majority of the season's overarching plot, which again is so surprising and ultimately impressive because of these three comics, that's the one that has the least going on. It's just a really forgettable story about this guy Bastion who hates mutants because he's actually an advanced sentinel, which are the robots that are programmed to hate and kill mutants. So he doesn't even really have an interesting reason for hating them. He kidnaps and tortures Professor X and Jubilee for a bunch of issues before Iceman, of all characters, finally stops him. And he's not even killed, he's just arrested by S.H.I.E.L.D. It's a story more about Bastion than any one X-Man, and again, we don't care about Bastion, so it's just a nothing burger. But again, Bo DeMaio's secret sauce is being a good writer who can make bad comic storylines interesting. So he just says, what if Bastion was interesting? And he does this primarily through a lot of style rather than like any particularly deep character development. First of all, he makes Bastion the mastermind behind the destruction of Genosha, which in the comic happened later and was done by a different villain. So that's another example of Bo streamlining the comic in the same way he did with Cyclops' baby. And you might say, hey, Greg, didn't you criticize Wolverine and the X-Men for combining too many comic storylines? And I'd say the difference is Bo does it more sparingly, and he always does it for a character based reason, not just for the fan service. In the comic, Genosha is destroyed by Cassandra Nova, Professor X's evil psychic twin, who you might recognize from the Deadpool and Wolverine movie. That works fine in the comic, but since she actually is a mutant of a kind, I think it's actually more logical that Bastion does it because he is this ultimate killing machine programmed to wipe out mutants. And the destruction of Genosha also hits harder in the show because Bo has fan favorite Gambit die as a result in a sequence that's just incredible. It's the standout action sequence of the show where Gambit uses his powers to blow up a 100-foot tall sentinel. He goes out like a king. In the comic, no one that we really cared about died in Genosha. Bastion then spends episode 7 attacking the X-Men with freaky zombie sentinels born from humans he infected with a nanovirus, which is badass, before he gets his first on-screen reveal, shaving Magneto, who is tied up in a chair. I think having your new villain completely humiliate your most classic villain is a great way to establish the new villain's legitimacy. And he shaves Magneto while listening to a record of Flying Purple People Eater, which is a really clever, fun reference because that's exactly what a Sentinel is. Again, it's just a stylish and cool way to introduce Bastion. Everything about him is epic and deadly and unique compared to the comic, where he couldn't have been more generic. And then, in the three-part finale, Bastion gets just enough backstory to make sense. His father was basically infected with a nanovirus that turned Bastion into a sentinel, and then we get to have fun watching the X-Men kick the crap out of him. And while that's going on, we simultaneously get another storyline inspired by yet another comic. Fatal Attractions is the only one of these three comic storylines that I actually like, and I don't just like it, I think it's one of the greatest X-Men comics of all time. It has Magneto turning evil again, creating a new brotherhood, and assembling them on a new version of his asteroid base, Asteroid M. He threatens to wipe out the Earth with an EMP blast, so Professor X assembles a team of X-Men and attacks the asteroid. It's one of the best action sequences in any X-Men comic, with them storming the base, Quicksilver doing a bunch of cool speedster stuff, and Wolverine straight up gutting Magneto, which in turn then makes Magneto rip out his skeleton, which I feel like that's something every X-Men fan has always wanted to see happen. Like, one of your main guys has a skeleton made out of the thing your main enemy can control. That should be a problem. But it wasn't really explored much until this storyline. The best part, though, is Rogue having to pilot the X-Jet away from the crashing asteroid while the ship breaks up around her and the other X-Men, and Wolverine is dying in the back. It's just awesome, and great character development all around for all of these characters. The reason this story is controversial among fans is that it turned Magneto evil again after he'd had a redemption arc throughout the 80s. So, what does Beau DeMaio do when adapting this? He keeps most of that intact and simply changes the one thing people didn't like. He gives Magneto a reason for turning on the Earth so that it doesn't feel so abrupt. By moving the destruction of Genosha forward, he again makes better use of that event by having it motivate Magneto in a big way. And the EMP blast isn't just a random threat against humanity this time, it's a last-ditch effort on Magneto's part to stop Bastion's zombie sentinels. Magneto's motivations are just much clearer here than in the comic. And similar to how he handled Madeline Pryor, Beau DeMaio doesn't have Magneto die here like he did in the comic. He redeems him and leaves him available for future storylines. And this all culminates in the X-Men defeating Bastion, but being scattered across time in the process, setting the second season up to adapt some more obscure comic storylines, namely the Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix from 1994 and the Rise of Apocalypse from 1996. So, once again, Beau DeMaio's secret sauce is playing the B-sides, but essentially doing a cover that totally transforms them into being equally as good as the greatest hits. Of course, this is all overshadowed by the fact that Beau was fired by Marvel after some allegations of workplace misconduct. I've researched that more, and there really just isn't enough released publicly for me to come down super hard on either side. I'll just say it's a shame either way that things ended up like this, and I'm at least glad that some of Beau's writing seems to have made it into seasons 2 and 3. I stand by my belief that the first season of X-Men 97 is the only really good X-Men adaptation, in the sense that it captures the character arcs and plot lines of the comic much better than any other adaptation. When it does make changes, it improves the story, and it does this by adapting stories that needed improving. And hopefully it's clear that I like things about all the other adaptations. I actually love X-Men First Class and Days of Future Past, but they are so far afield from what the comic is that I just enjoy them as movies more than adaptations. And if nothing else, X-Men 97 is the only adaptation that gets both Cyclops and Storm right, who the movies both totally failed to adapt almost at all. I didn't say much about the cartoon's adaptation of Storm's life-death storyline, just because it's mostly a subplot, but it's a good comic, and Beau DeMaio adapts it pretty directly, so yeah, it makes for some good episodes. Cyclops and Storm are essentially the main characters of the comic. It's about their developing leadership and how they adapt their leadership style to new obstacles. To be a good X-Men adaptation, you have to have that dynamic, and X-Men 97 is the only adaptation that has that at all. I mean, just look at this clip of Jean and Storm.
Believe, not in a dream or our gifts, but in each other.
Make them mind your weather, sister.
And them weather your mind.
That's a hell of a lot better than this.
Jean.
Have I convinced you? If so, please subscribe. If not, tell me what a fool I am in the comments and subscribe anyways so you can argue with me more in the future. I'll see you next time. Da-na-na-na-na-na. 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 Da-na-na-na-na.